And we're back with our political panel. Amy Walter is with the Cook Political Report. Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. Shawna Thomas is the Washington bureau chief at Vice News. And Nancy Cordes is our CBS News chief congressional correspondent. She spent most of the week in Florida and Georgia on the campaign trail. We're glad to have you in one place for us here, Nancy. Ben, I want to start with you. The chairwoman of the Republican Party did not want to touch that ad run by the president's campaign with a 20-foot pole. So that's one thing which you can address, but also it represents two closing messages here. Chairwoman McDaniel wants to talk about the economy and the strong numbers. The president wants to talk about something else.
You know, it's really telling that this is the closing weekend of a campaign season. The president just got all these great numbers in terms of the economic reports that came out. We have wage growth that we haven't seen in more than a decade in terms of the experience of the American economy. And yet that doesn't seem to be the thing that he wants to talk about at all. It's not the thing that Republicans are really talking about. This is an election that for them is a base election, and what they know is that what gets their base out there and excited and ramped up is questions of security, questions of toughness, questions of law and order, and not, hey, you've got 3.1% wage growth.
Right. Don't you have the same exact problem on the other side, which is when you hear an ad like that, when you hear some of the things the president says, people who are black, Hispanic are saying, this sounds a little bit racist to me, and that can gin people up on the Democratic side, too.
And not only that, you had Republicans saying this sounds racist to me. So it wasn't even, I mean, it was extraordinary to see so many Republicans come out and just straight up say this was a racist appeal. Nancy, you've been, sorry, I'm used to having Anthony to my left, Nancy. You've been out there. Yep. We shape this race in a lot of ways, but out in the real world, what are you seeing? How much are Democrats talking about health care and not taking the bait on some of these values issues, or what are you seeing?
Health care is huge. In fact, over the course of this election, Democrats have spent about $90 million on ads about health care. They think that this is the winning issue. Obamacare is much more popular now than it was even a few years ago. At this point, everyone knows someone with a pre-existing condition who is getting coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. Everyone watched Republicans fumble this issue last year when suddenly they had the opportunity to come up with a plan that was panned by most healthcare groups, and people are worried about protections for people with pre-existing conditions going away. Democrats believe that that is going to be a motivating factor for enough voters, and some of the polling bears that out.
Shawna, the Democrats have shown a remarkable, I think of Will Rogers' line, I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat, shown amazing discipline and sticking to the health care message despite the efforts by the president and the press to pull them on to something else. Do you see it that way?
I see it a little bit that way. I think one of the things that's been interesting to me is I was in Idaho, which is not a bastion of Democratic politics, I understand, last week. But Medicaid expansion is on the ballot. Yeah. And even with conservatives, they seem to be going in the direction of voting for entrenching Obamacare within Idaho. And while that doesn't mean like there will suddenly be a Democratic governor of Idaho, that does mean there's something to that health care message that speaks to a lot of people. And Democrats know that. And in some of these swing districts, that could help them turn some of the Republicans their way, possibly.
And it's also why the issue about the economy and the tax cuts isn't getting as much traction, not just from the president, but even in some of these congressional races, because what you hear from voters a lot is, that's great, maybe have a little more money, but you know what I'm spending it on? My prescription drugs, or I'm spending it on my health care costs. The cost of living is going higher than what I'm getting in my salary or whatever I got from the tax cut. And so it's a very difficult message for Republicans to sort of nuance this discussion about how great the economy is with people who are actually worrying about the most salient thing in their life and the thing they probably spend the most money on other than food, which is their health care.
I was down in Florida this week talking to Carlos Curbelo, who is in one of these classic swing districts in Florida. He said that he wishes the president would talk more about the economy. I mean, we're at 3.7% unemployment. We haven't seen a level that low since Lyndon Johnson. But the president himself admitted this week it's boring to talk about the economy. He'd rather gin people up and talk about immigration. And that is really difficult for a Republican like Curbelo in a swing district.
Well, that's why he said that caravan really ginned up our base when he was in his rally. Ben, let me Mike Kaufman, 6th District of Colorado, another one of those tough seats up. One of his strategists said, in the last week, the president has behaved like a guy trying to build a permanent political majority in the Ozarks. The purposeful provocation on immigration just makes an already grim situation in the suburbs even more difficult. Is this a president running in a kind of Senate, save the Senate strategy, which hurts in these suburban districts that Shawna was talking about?
Absolutely. And I think that that's because the Senate matters more to the president than a lot of these different House members, many of whom he doesn't even know. He doesn't have a relationship with them. He knows who John Tester is. He knows who Heidi Heitkamp is. He knows who Claire McCaskill is. And he dislikes them, and he wants to see them out. And so that's the reason that he's using the kind of approach that he has. But I think Republicans need to keep in mind, one of the real things we're going to learn in this midterm is how effective the president's strategy is in comparison to the approach that President Obama used. The problem with President Obama was that when he was on the ballot, his team came out, his base came out, they showed up. This is now President Trump trying to figure out whether he can do the same thing, in an election when he's not on the ballot, which was the same problem that was a real challenge during the Obama years for other Democrats.
In the exit polls in 2010, Democrats did not come out for President Obama to defend him in the way that our polls show that Republicans are coming to defend Donald Trump.
Yeah, and that's where that low propensity voter that I talked about earlier with Anthony, especially these voters on the Republican side, they came out for Donald Trump, don't traditionally come out. An issue like the economy, that's not going to motivate them to get out to vote. On immigration, that's going to be the issue. The question, though, in my mind, too, is there are sort of these different tiers of seats that I'm going to be watching on election night. There's the tier that we talk about, those suburban districts, especially those suburban districts that Hillary Clinton carried, Northern Virginia suburbs, Philadelphia suburbs. Thankfully, a lot of these are on East Coast time. For those of us on the East Coast, we can watch these come in. New Jersey. But the districts I'm most interested, actually, are the ones that President Obama carried, but then Trump carried, right? Those districts, like, for example, in Maine, another East Coast state,
too.
big, Maine, too. It's big, has Democratic DNA. This is a labor stronghold there. Been voting for Democrats forever, but like so much of working class America, moved to Trump in 2016. Where did those voters go in 2018? That's going to tell us, first of all, whether Democrats have a great night or just an okay night, and also what it means about this Trump coalition. Do they show up only when Trump's on the ballot, or have they also decided they're not as enamored with Trump in some of these places that have Democratic DNA than in some of the other parts of the country like the South?
And look, let's face it, I mean, Democrats have almost nowhere to go but up. Republicans have a near historic majority in the House right now. They picked up 63 seats back in 2010. They added to it after that. So if Democrats don't pick up seats on Tuesday night, then the party has even bigger problems than I thought.
And a historic anomaly. Hold these thoughts. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more from our panel. And we're back with more from our panel. Shawna, you've been looking at the 25th District in California. Why?
Well, basically, Vice News has been following Katie Hill around since February to track how a congressional campaign works. But what's interesting is this is one of those districts that went for Hillary Clinton in 2016, but elected a Republican congressman. It is an incredibly tight race, and it's gotten tighter in the last few weeks. And it doesn't seem like it's because of health care. It doesn't seem like it's because of immigration or race baiting. It seems like it's because there's a gas tax repeal on the ballot. And these are people who live 40, 50 miles from L.A. proper. They vote on their pocketbooks. It's actually kind of standard politics, which I have to admit I was kind of happy to see.
Sure, yes, regular old politics.
Exactly. Your pocketbook and gas.
Right, exactly. Nancy, what are you going to be looking for on Tuesday night?
Well, I'm watching for a couple of things. First of all, women. I think that that's going to be really fascinating. I mean, anecdotally, we see that women, particularly educated women, have been turned off by some of the things that President Trump has to say. They were turned off by the Kavanaugh nomination spectacle. Are they really, moving towards the Democratic Party, or, do they come home at the end of the day? I think for me, another thing is independent voters, and whether President Trump really is the kryptonite to independent voters that we've seen in some of the polling recently. And then finally, this split between the House and the Senate. I mean, it's very possible that even if Democrats take control of the House, they could lose a seat or two in the Senate. And what does that mean for the balance of power in Washington and the ability of Congress to get anything done over the next 2 years?
Ben, do you think that Republicans are taking lessons from what the president's doing? And maybe the lessons will all be determined by the final outcome. But let's say Republicans have a better night. What will Republicans see from the president's strategy here at the end? I mean, you know, what learnings will they take from that going forward? Well,
I think that they'll be, frankly, one of the lessons they'll take is that it doesn't help to sort of shy away from cultural war. I think the president has really, wrapped his arms around the cultural war in America in a way that we haven't seen a politician do before in the modern era. And I think that the lesson that a lot of different Republican politicians are taking away from that is that this is something that they should be eager for. In terms of what I'm kind of going to be looking at, early on in the night, I think we're going to know how big of a wave we're going to see thanks to some of the kind of pairs of seats in some of these early East Coast states. I look at something like Virginia 5 and Virginia 7. If both of those go to Democrats, then that means that we're probably in for a blue tidal wave. And historically, that is, I think, what we should expect to happen in this election. We should expect it to break in the direction of Democrats and break in that way significantly. On the flip side, I look at a state like Florida and anticipating the kind of historical ticket splitting that you've seen there could easily result in a situation where perhaps Rick Scott wins the Senate seat, Andrew Gillum wins the governorship. That's going to be a huge factor in terms of determining things post the next census and everything else that happens in a state that's critical for the presidential year.
You've been down in Florida. What have you noticed in Florida that's different from every other Florida when we're obsessed with Florida every other election cycle?
Well, it's fascinating to have this marquee race, at the top of the ticket, this governor's race that is driving so much. I think Senator Nelson, for example, would be in much worse shape if he didn't have this incredibly dynamic campaigner at the top of the ballot in Andrew Gillum, who's sort of, if Nelson does win on Tuesday night, he will have Gillum in part to thank for that. But I'll also be very curious to see, some of the strategy for Andrew Gillum, for someone like a Stacey Abrams in Georgia, for someone like a Beto O'Rourke in Texas, has to do with fundamentally changing the electorate in their states. And they have a lot of confidence that they're doing that. We see some anecdotal signs in early voting that they might be right, but it's a peril to read too much into early voting. But that is going to be fascinating as well. At the end of the day, did they manage to really change the electorate in their states, bring out hundreds of thousands of new voters, minority voters, who don't typically vote in midterm elections, let alone presidential elections?
And that's going to set the tone for 2020, quite frankly, because for all the talk about what is the president doing to see if he can get his base out and what lessons are Republicans going to take from this, what lessons are Democrats going to take if they succeed or if they fail about the kind of candidate they need on top of the ticket in 2020.
If the lessons from the culture war that you're talking about, the Republicans learned that embracing that works, if we also see an amazing turnout of minority voters in Florida and Georgia, Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gillum win, that shows that culture war may not be a good thing to embrace come 2020.
Mm-hmm. What role do you think the president has played, if at all, President Obama here talking about?
I mean, you know what? I always ask a bunch of Democrats all the time, who is the leader of the Democratic Party? And usually the answer I either get is they don't know who the leader of the Democratic Party is, or Barack Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party. The guy who's at the top still, the guy who energizes people, is coming out. That reminds people that there is an election. I think that's about the best you can do right now.
And what do you make of the Midwest? We had the president doing well there in 2016. The president did well there in 2016. People said, oh, the Midwest is changing. But now a lot of Republicans are in trouble.
You could absolutely see Scott Walker lose, I think, on Tuesday. I think you could see a lot of difficulty in parts of the Midwest. But back to this culture war point, I think that the fact is, you look at a state like Missouri, where Claire McCaskill made the calculated judgment to go against Brett Kavanaugh in a similar situation to what was facing Joe Manchin, a state where the president is significantly popular. And that's really, frankly, put Josh Hawley back into a position where he could beat her, when before it was a race that looked like it might actually be out of reach for Republicans. This is going to be a very interesting night because there's so many different lessons to take away from it. Democrats are going to be able to take a lesson away of, yes, we resisted, yes, we came back, we took back the House after having all these years of not being able to be in leadership post the Obamacare decision. And then Republicans are going to, I think, take a lot of lessons away from which senators they are able to replace choice, if any, on the Democratic side. That's going to flow into the decisions they make in 2020, as Amy said, about the nomination battle.
And in 1982, Walter Mondale was on the CBS Evening News on election night preparing for his 84 race. So 2020 is going to start right on election night, too. I'm just saying that's what history tells us. I can't, not me, it's history. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and we'll be right back.